Kia ora. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be with you. Sorry for that bit of a chilly start. Creepy is how Kayleen described it. I agree. I think the challenges we face as we prepare young people to be workers, to be citizens, to be lifelong learners has really sort of gotten considerably more complex since when I first started teaching. When I began teaching, it was the twilight of the industrial era. We still talked about preparing people for work in factories, work that, of course, now robots do almost entirely. Peter Drucker coined that term in 1959. And a lot of people today still talk about it being the era of the knowledge economy, but that's no longer true either. The idea of the knowledge economy was that if you know more than the person next to you, you have a competitive advantage. Well, not today. Because you see, Google knows everything. And the world no longer cares how much our students know. Today, in the innovation era, what the world cares about is what they can do with what they know. And can they do things that robots can't? So I want to talk a little bit about how do we prepare young people for this world? How do we prepare young people for the innovation era? But first, some descriptions, some definitions. Innovation's a buzzword. You think innovation always equals high tech. That's not been what I've been learning. Set out to understand innovation. I came to understand, first of all, there's two kinds of innovation. One kind of innovation is a lot about what you just saw, bringing new possibilities to life. Think of Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. Problem with that kind of innovation is you can't prepare a young person for that. That's more a matter of nature than nurture. You can't educate a Steve Jobs to be bringing new possibilities to life. In fact, he dropped out of college, as did Bill Gates, as did Mark Zuckerberg, somebody else who brought new possibilities to life. But what I discovered is that there's another kind of innovation that is at least as important, and that's creative problem solving. In any domain, creative problem solving in terms of increasing opportunities for health, for education, solving basic problems of clean water in the third world. And here's the good news. We are born curious, creative, imaginative. That is the human DNA. The average 5-year-old asks 100 questions a day. I've got grandchildren now, I know. And you know, most young people think of themselves as artists in kindergarten. My grandchildren, more than anything, love to draw, to paint, to color. But then something happens. You see, the longer kids are in school, the fewer questions they ask. It's proven. The fewer think of themselves as artistic in any way. That thing that happens, we call school. So the question I've been asking is, what must we do differently to prepare all young people, not just for the new world of work, but equally important, for active citizenship, for creative and productive leisure, and for lifelong learning? Now, to answer that question, what I've done is interview a wide variety of young people, first in the US, but then all over the world, all of whom were creative problem solvers in very different domains. Some were in high tech, some were social entrepreneurs solving social problems, some were artists. But in every case, they had already had some recognition by the time they were in their 20s as being creative problem solvers. So I asked them what have been the most important influences in their development as young people. I asked them about education, of course. I interviewed all of their parents to see if I could see patterns of parenting. But it was their answers to the education questions that were disturbing to say the least. You see, some of them had gone to what are reputed to be some of our best universities, at least here in the US. MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon. And they all told me they had become innovators and creative problem solvers in spite of their education, not because of it. Now, being a lifelong educator, that was, you can imagine, deeply disturbing. First bad news of my particular research endeavor this time. But I persisted. I said, come on, please, can you tell me any kind of bright spots in your learning? They could all name at least one teacher who'd made a real difference in their lives. And the age range of those teachers taught was kindergarten to graduate school. Rarely more than a couple of teachers, but always at least one. So I interviewed all of those teachers, watched many of them teach, and I found an interesting pattern of similarities in how they taught, how they thought about learning. Then I went to those few schools that really do have a reputation for teaching creative problem-solving schools in the United States. There's the brand new Olin College of Engineering, now just a decade old, O-L-I-N, very interesting place. There's the MIT Media Lab. There's the D School at Stanford. Then there's a number of secondary school networks, High Tech High, New Tech High, EdVisions, EnVisions, Expeditionary Learning. Went to elementary schools, Reggio Emilia, Montessori. And again, saw a remarkable pattern of similarities across all of those schools that were completely consistent with my teachers whom I had observed. And here's the problem. Well, some of those systems, like Montessori, have been around a very long time. They're not mainstream yet, are they? And all of those teachers whom I interviewed, I discovered had one thing in common above all else. They were outliers, teaching in ways that were very different than their peers. In fact, at the college level, none of them had tenure, nor were they going to get tenure, even though they were at some prestigious universities. So what I came to understand through all of this inquiry over a number of years is that there are a set of very fundamental contradictions between the traditional culture of schooling, which is now more than a century old, a culture of schooling that was born at the dawn of the industrial era, and the culture of learning that is required to develop the capabilities of creative problem solving, again, in any domain. First contradiction are all of the ways in which in traditional schooling we celebrate and reward individual achievement. Well, that's fine. That's important. But the world of innovation is all about teamwork. There is no innovation without deep collaboration. It's a myth that individuals, whether it's Thomas Edison or Steve Jobs, did it all by themselves. They did not. The research is extremely clear. Knowing this, these teachers whom I had observed and with whom I spoke developed team-based projects in every single unit of study. And teams had what we call shared accountability. And they actually reviewed one another's contributions to the team effort as a part of their assessment process. So that it wasn't the usual group work where one kid does all the stuff. Second contradiction are all the ways in which we compartmentalize knowledge and favor specialization the higher up we go on the education ladder. But here's the problem. What I learned is that not a single problem that you can name can be understood, let alone solved, in the context of a single academic discipline. Knowing this, these outlier teachers created interdisciplinary courses around what we would call an essential question or a problem that had no ready answer. It required multiple disciplines to understand. Contradiction 3 is the culture of classrooms that I see so often around the world. It's a culture of passivity. It's a culture of compliance. It's a culture of too much sitting and getting. The world of innovation, however, rewards and demands that you take initiative, that you question authority. It's a disruptive world. And the teachers in those kinds of schools that are teaching creative problem solving see their role very differently. They see their role first and foremost as coaches, performance coaches, coaching students to higher performance standards. And they know that students throughout that room have knowledge and understandings that need to be shared and valued, not just theirs. The fourth and fifth challenges and contradictions, I think, are some of the most difficult of all. See, contradiction 4 is all about the F word in school. Failure. Worst thing that can happen to you, right? We all have dreams where we express our fear of failing in different ways, not ready for an exam. With mine, and so I turned my dissertation in too late. I dream about every month or so. Turned it in 25 years ago. Fear of failure. Where does that come from? Well, I think it comes from school. Because you see, in school, the higher up we go, the more our failures and mistakes count against us. We are graded on the basis of the numbers of mistakes we make. That's what the bell curve is all about. But here's the problem. Innovation demands that you take risks, that you make mistakes, and that you fail. Company mottos are, like IDEO has a company motto, fail early, fail often. Most innovative design company in the world. Other companies talk about fail fast, fail forward, fail cheap, fail smart, but fail. We don't talk about failing as a good thing in schools, do we? But they do. What's the difference? Here it is, quite simply, that the world of innovation demands what we know as rapid prototyping, learning through trial and error. Learning through trial and error. And that's not new. That's how we all learn, really. How many of you learn more from your mistakes than your successes? Please raise your hand. The three of you that didn't raise your hand, I want to talk to you afterwards. We learn more from our mistakes. What if we said to a child, look, I'm sorry, you cannot speak until you can speak in complete and grammatically correct sentences. None of this mumbling and muttering stuff. Oh, and by the way, no walking until you can walk in a straight line, no crawling. We're not allowing it. Bicycle riding out of the question because we know you're going to fall and skin your knee. Human beings learn most of our important things through trial and error. Why, then, do we turn mistakes kids make into lessons about failure? Why? There are only 3 grades I can justify, and only 3 grades I've used as a teacher of both secondary and college. A, B, or incomplete. No pluses and minuses. How many would like to fly with a C- airline pilot? Raise your hands. You know, one is pretty good at takeoffs, not so good at landings. So a B in my class was a performance standard that was met through exhibition of a body of work, not a single paper. I never graded individual papers. Lots of feedback, but never a grade. You know what happens when you put a grade on a student's paper? You find it in the trash can as they're leaving. But you mark comments, and they attend to them. So long before there were digital portfolios, I had every student keep a paper portfolio. It was a body of work. And I expected every student to meet a certain standard in their work. That was a B. If they hadn't met that standard yet, they hadn't failed. They just hadn't gotten my certificate, my certificate of mastery in my class. So I gave them more time, or I gave them more help. But the standard stayed the same. And it was a standard that could be met in a great variety of ways. But they had to show me mastery, proficiency of reading and writing to a certain standard. But again, showing it in different ways, allowing for the individuality of different children. Now, if a student wanted an A, they had to explain to me what they thought real excellence was. And it's pretty rare, as we know. Human excellence is not a common thing. The last contradiction is a contradiction about motivation. Because I think, you know, the reason we rely so heavily on grades and scores and things like that is we think it's going to be a good way to motivate kids. You know, fear. But as we really know, fear isn't the best motivator. It isn't a good motivator at all, is it? In fact, when I interview these young people, again, from a wide variety of backgrounds, equal number of women and men, some from privilege, some from extreme poverty. When I interviewed them, what I discovered is that what most motivated them to do their best work was not the promise of a higher grade, not the promise of more money. It was a deep desire to make a difference, to make a contribution. They were intrinsically motivated. So I went back and through all of my research, all of the scribblings from interviews with parents and teachers, trying to understand what had their parents and teachers done differently to kind of strengthen the intrinsic motivation that, in fact, we're all born with. What had they done differently? And I discovered something, a pattern. Both parents and teachers had explicitly encouraged three things: play, passion, and purpose. Parents encouraged more exploratory play, more time outside, fewer toys with batteries, very limited screen time. Teachers tried to create a space in their curriculum for students to explore, to sort of ask their own questions and pursue them. As the kids grew older, parents encouraged them to try a lot of different things in order to discover what most interested them. What the parents intuitively understood is that thing we call grit or perseverance or tenacity is best developed when you're pursuing a real interest. And the challenge, of course, is that interests just don't kind of grow on trees. You have to discover them by staying curious. And one of my biggest fears, in fact, is that schools diminish curiosity, which is always about asking questions, exploring possibilities. And the interesting thing is that curiosity becomes interests. Interests over time, as young people became adults, grew into passions. But in every case, what I learned was that the passions weren't enough, because the requirement was that passions evolve into a deeper sense of purpose. And I discovered that parents and teachers had encouraged this with a very clear and simple message, a message that we all know well, education being a calling every bit as much as it is a profession. The message was this: we are not here on this earth just to serve ourselves. We have some responsibility to give back and to make a difference. And that's what had really fueled the intrinsic motivation of these young people, an evolution from play to passion to purpose. Now here's the fascinating thing. Purpose in an adult world, in an adult's life, becomes a kind of mature play, a kind of disciplined play. I'm deeply purpose-driven in my work, but at the same time, it is my sense of play, being in the adult world. So there's a lot we could talk about in terms of how we get from where we are now to where we need to be to prepare all young people for work, for citizenship, for active and creative leisure, and for lifelong learning. The interesting thing that I've learned is that the skills you need for the world of innovation are exactly the same skills you need for active and informed citizenship: critical thinking, collaboration, effective communication, creative problem solving. And they're the same skills you need to be a lifelong learner. And I think they're the capabilities that we were all going to need as we have more and more leisure. We live longer, or we're between jobs for more periods of time. We're going to need to know how to use our leisure in ways that are creative, not consumptive. We are consuming our futures because we are defining leisure as opportunities to consume more, not to create more. So there's more at stake than just helping kids have job-related skills. Much, much more at stake. Citizenship. I have an election in 2 weeks in my country. I'm terrified, frankly. I really am. There is so much at stake. In fact, I was going to ask you if I could borrow your prime minister for a couple of years until this thing kind of blows over. I have to laugh or I'll cry. We haven't prepared our kids for citizenship in my country. Not in any way, shape, or form. Prepared them for tests. Prepared them for admissions to colleges. Not citizenship. We haven't even asked the question. So I don't want to give away my talk tomorrow, because the talk today is really about why change. What's the problem we have to solve? And it's my favorite quote from Einstein: "The formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution." Our first challenge as change leaders, which I'll talk about more tomorrow, is to more clearly articulate the problem or the challenges that we think need solving in our profession. And I understand you have an extraordinary historical moment to do that in this country, where you've, I gathered, given up the national curriculum and finally begun to ask the question of, well, what really must we do differently to prepare all young people? And I urge you to think about those 4 categories as you answer that question: work, citizenship, lifelong learning, and leisure. Because an answer to just one is incomplete. When I began studying to become a teacher, I made a very personal connection to your country. It's my first time here. Yesterday was my first day. My wife and I had the most wonderful time walking all over the city, exploring your National Museum, learning more about the Maori traditions and experiences here. I was greeted with a nose rub this morning. I know you call it something else, but I hadn't quite remembered, because I'm still in another time zone, what that meant. I was a little unsettled, as you can imagine. But it was a wonderful greeting. I love the idea of a shared breath. But the point I wanted to make is that as I began my teaching career, there were 2 New Zealand educators who had an absolutely profound influence on my learning and on my thinking. I don't know if you even know of them or of their names anymore. Elwyn Richardson was one. He wrote an extraordinary book called In the Early World. It's a book with the most beautiful photographs of children's artwork, their clay work, their drama, their poetry. And he taught in a rural setting. I think it was primarily Maori children whom he taught. But he used their desires to create as the means to help them learn about the world around them. He's trained as a scientist. And he taught them the powers of observing the natural world and then translating that into art. And then they learned to collectively critique one another's work to take it more deeply. In the early world. I hope the book is still available. I encourage you to look at it. It's inspiring, to me still. I still have it on my shelf. There are very few education books I've kept, but that's one of them. The other educator from New Zealand who had a profound influence on me was Sylvia Ashton Warner. Any of you know her name? Teacher, of course. You know, how many of you use one-look words? Do you know that idea? Raise your hand if you ever heard of that term, one-look word. Sylvia Ashton Warner taught kids to read by asking them to bring her a word every week that they wanted to learn to read. She'd write down on a 3x5 card. And love, kiss, touch. Words that had emotional power and resonance, they remembered. And so that card stayed in their pile. They come back a week later, they couldn't read the word. She knew that it wasn't important enough for them yet, and she tossed it away. Extraordinary, the book Teacher. In both cases, these educators working with highly impoverished children worked to develop their intrinsic motivation, worked to stimulate and nurture their curiosity through both head and heart. You know, we think of learning so much as a narrow sliver of the head. They understood that it was about heaven and heart. So I gained from them a kind of a sense of acknowledgement of what was truly important. And what I'm trying to do now is take those intuitive insights that I gained 50 years ago nearly and translate them into the modern context where the kind of learning I'm describing now is not just a humanistic nice to have, but a must have. All kids must be prepared for work, learning, citizenship, and leisure. It's not something that is merely desirable any longer. So I'll talk more about what we do as change leaders to try to bring these things about, but I'm going to leave that for tomorrow because I want to give you some more time right now to get a look at what it kind of looks like in a classroom. I brought a 5-minute video clip along from our film, Most Likely to Succeed. How many have seen that film yet, that documentary? You can look online. It's actually now available in YouTube's, Google Play, and a couple of others. So you can actually get it for your school and play it very inexpensively. But it's a documentary film that my colleague, Ted Dintersmith, who did that Future Work video, by the way, and who has a wonderful new book called What School Could Be. But he created that video, and I worked with him to create that documentary film called Most Likely to Succeed, because we wanted to try to begin to answer the question, all right, if you translate everything that I've just said into a school, what does it look like? So we're going to see a 9th grade classroom in a charter school in San Diego. Now, I know what you may have heard about charter schools, and most of what you may have heard is probably true. It's not good. But this charter school is different. It doesn't take just selective kids. It takes kids by lottery, by area of the city, we call zip codes. San Diego being a predominantly minority city with a high degree of poverty, the same is reflected in the school. It's about 60% minority, about 45, 50% poverty. Despite that fact that nearly 100% graduate and all of the kids go on to colleges. Not that college should be a requirement, by the way. It's a conversation for another time. So this is a 9th grade class where teams of teachers teach groups of kids for a good chunk of the day. There's a teacher in this video who's a humanities teacher, teaching both history and English. Then there's another teacher who's teaching engineering, math, and science. And they're using projects. Not that project-based learning is the only way to do this. That's what these teachers are doing. So as you watch this video, I invite you to keep a few things in mind. Number one, what academic content knowledge are they learning? Content knowledge still matters. You got to know stuff. But skills matter more in the 21st century. And motivation matters most. Because if you're self-motivated, you will continuously acquire new content knowledge and new skills throughout your life. So look first at what content knowledge are students learning. Secondly, what skills are they learning? And finally, how are they being motivated to do their best work? Then here's the bonus question for you. How many of you are primary or intermediate educators? Raise your hands. Most of you, right? I thought so. Good. Secondary? Raise your hands. None? Oh, dear. So at any rate, here's the question I would kind of pose for you, and I'm really intrigued. If you had to prepare your young people for that 9th grade, that beginning secondary class, to prepare them well for that, what would you have to do differently? What help would you need? And how is what you'd have to do to prepare them for that 9th grade class that I'm about to show you, how is that different than what you may be doing today? What's the gap? What's the difference? All right, so I'm going to invite in just a moment you to look at this video for 5 minutes, and then what I'd like you to do is spend at least 5 minutes sharing at your tables. Whether you want to do it in pairs or as a whole table, obviously in the back, just be pair sharing, that's fine. But consider 1 or 2 important things you may have heard this morning or seen in the videos. 1 or 2 concerns you have, things you disagree with, but mostly 1 or 2 important questions you have, because I want to end our time together with questions and conversation where I get to learn from you. So let's watch this video, and I will be back with you in about 10 minutes, after the video and after your time in conversation.
The philosophy of High Tech High is founded largely on the idea of kids making, doing, building, shaping, and inventing stuff. The engineers that I know, the architects I know, the artists I know, the great educators that I know, the entrepreneurs that I know, are all sort of perplexed and curious about how they can do it better the next time. And that type of perplexity leads to engagement, it leads to learning, it leads to innovation. We are trying to have that type of perplexity and curiosity get inculcated in our students in everyday practices.
In both Linkabit and Qualcomm, one of our problems was being able to hire enough qualified people, enough trained people. And so it was kind of a long-term view to set up High Tech High.
Oh, I don't think it's that the glue worked. I think I know what's wrong. And
like if you have 0.2 spacing and 0.01, the gears won't connect at all.
We didn't know that it was all going to work until maybe 4 weeks before exhibition, 3 weeks.
I mean, we knew that pieces of it were working, right? And even those pieces were impressive.
We had to learn about civilizations, the Mayans, the Romans, and the Greeks. And Scott and Mike didn't want to just teach us this, so they came up with this big wheel, which is a big gear, which has a lot of drawings on it, and it's connected to all these other mechanisms, and they each represented our theory. So I learned about the Mayans, the Greeks, and the Romans, and I really based my theory off of the Romans.
Mm-hmm. And why so?
Because it has to do with expanding. They were always expanding, and what I realized is that they were expanding not because, not just for the fun of it, but they needed resources for all the people back home, Italy and all the ones that they, all the new places that they took over.
Then they had to, on their own, develop and defend an idea on why they think civilizations rise and fall.
So we had to create like a flow chart just explaining what our theory was, and then we got critiques on it, and then we created a group one.
Another piece is on the mechanical side. They need to take what's already an abstract concept with their theory, and they have to take that and actually physically manifest it. They have some very preliminary metrics they need to use. They know that there's going to be a big wheel turning at a certain RPM. They know how many teeth that is, so they have basically a box to work within, some bounds to work within, and they have to make everything.
Yeah, I can get one.
Oh, I put the wrong side in. Oh my God.
So we have an exhibition that we're preparing for right now, and it'll be tomorrow night, and there will be thousands of people here looking at student work, students presenting their work, visitors looking at the work, students presenting their work to each other. And I think that idea of making work public, that's a missing piece to me in schools in general.
For most of you, this is probably the biggest project that you've ever exhibited. A lot of you, it's the first project that you've ever really had a public exhibition of. All right? Cool. We're going to be here. If you need to go, we understand, but we're going to keep working for a few hours. Break.
This idea of sort of making something and having a public exhibition and having people come look at it. And you have that feeling that we all have, like, how did they do that?
You really need to understand it, and you really need to understand why you need to know this to be able to complete the project.
What astounded me was that while doing research, my theory, it actually fit with a lot of these civilizations. It wasn't just like some random theory.
When kids have that feeling, it's transformative for them. I made this, and everyone's coming to look at it.